Good evening. Let us look more carefully at what is happening here tonight, because if you believe this story is simply about American aircraft entering a disputed waterway, you are looking at the headline and missing the architecture. Let me tell you something most analysts will not say clearly in the next 72 hours. The deployment of A-10 Warthog ground attack aircraft into the operational theater surrounding the Strait of Hormuz is not primarily a show of force. It is the visible marker of a strategic calculus shift that has been building for 18 months, and what it signals about Iran's eroding deterrence position will reshape regional behavior in ways that extend far beyond this single deployment. Tonight, I want to examine not what happened, but what this deployment reveals about the hidden structure of power in the Persian Gulf, and why the Iranian leadership is facing a dilemma they cannot solve through their existing playbook. Most coverage tonight will focus on the aircraft themselves, on flight patterns, on proximity to Iranian territorial waters, on the rhetoric from Tehran. That is the surface. That is what everyone is watching. But here is what that framing misses entirely. The deployment of the A-10 Warthog, a platform designed specifically for close air support and anti-armor operations in contested environments, tells us something far more significant than a routine power projection exercise. It tells us that the United States has made a calculated assessment that Iran's layered naval deterrence architecture in the Strait, the fast attack boats, the anti-ship missile batteries, the coastal defense systems that have formed the backbone of Iranian asymmetric strategy for 3 decades, are now sufficiently degraded or sufficiently mapped that low-altitude, slow-moving, heavily armed aircraft can operate in that envelope with acceptable risk. Think about what that assessment means. The A-10 is not a standoff platform. It is not a stealth aircraft. It operates at altitudes where it is visible, where it is vulnerable to surface-to-air systems, where it must commit to an engagement geometry that exposes it to defensive fire. The decision to position these aircraft in this theater is a statement, but not the statement the headlines are describing. Now let me state the thesis clearly so we can examine it properly. What we are watching is not an escalation in the conventional sense. What we are watching is the operational conclusion of a 2-year intelligence and targeting preparation cycle that has systematically mapped, penetrated, and neutralized the sensor and command networks that made Iran's Strait of Hormuz closure threat credible. And the reason this matters, the reason this is a strategic inflection and not just another deployment, is because that closure threat has been the centerpiece of Iranian deterrence theory since 1984. It has been the card Tehran plays in every negotiation about sanctions, about nuclear programs, about regional behavior. The implicit bargain has always been this: do not push us too far because we can close the strait and the global economy cannot tolerate the disruption. But if that threat is no longer operationally credible, if the United States and its regional partners now possess the surveillance architecture and the strike capability to keep that waterway open even under direct Iranian interdiction attempts, then the entire regional power structure shifts. Iran does not lose its military. Iran loses its primary source of strategic leverage. And that is what makes this moment different from the dozens of other Gulf confrontations we have seen over the last 40 years. If you found that analysis valuable, consider subscribing for ongoing strategic breakdowns, because what I want to show you now is how we arrived at this point and why the specific choice of the A-10 Warthog reveals more about American operational confidence than any official statement ever could. Let us establish the immediate context first. The Strait of Hormuz is not simply a waterway. It is the most strategically critical energy chokepoint on Earth. Approximately 21 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products pass through this 33-kilometer wide channel every single day. That represents roughly 21% of global petroleum consumption. The strait is bounded by Iran to the north and Oman and the United Arab Emirates to the south. The navigable shipping lanes, the deep water channels that supertankers must use, pass within 12 nautical miles of Iranian territorial waters at their narrowest point. Iran has spent 4 decades building a defensive strategy around the geographic reality of that proximity. fast attack craft equipped with anti-ship missiles, coastal artillery positions, submarine and mine-laying capabilities, swarm tactics designed to overwhelm defensive systems through sheer numbers. The doctrine has always been clear. Iran cannot defeat the United States Navy in a conventional engagement, but it can make the cost of keeping the strait open prohibitively high. It can turn every tanker transit into a risk calculation, it can force insurance rates to spike, it can create enough uncertainty that global oil markets price in a persistent risk premium. That has been the deterrence model. But deterrence is not about capability alone. Deterrence is about credibility. It is about your adversary believing that you will act and that your action will produce consequences they cannot tolerate. And credibility requires two things: the operational capacity to execute the threat and the opponent's uncertainty about your intelligence picture and their response effectiveness. Now let us go one level deeper into what has changed. Over the last 18 months, we have seen a systematic pattern of intelligence sharing agreements between the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates that has produced unprecedented surveillance density over Iranian military infrastructure. Commercial satellite analysis from January 2025 showed American and allied reconnaissance assets maintaining 24-hour optical and radar coverage of every major Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps naval facility along the Gulf Coast. In March 2025, there were reports, not officially confirmed but widely discussed in regional security circles, of underwater mapping operations that charted Iranian submarine patrol patterns and mine storage sites with precision that would have been impossible 5 years ago. In June 2025, a cyber attack, again not officially attributed but consistent with American and Israeli capabilities, disrupted Iranian coastal radar networks for 72 hours. Each of these events, taken individually, looks like routine intelligence work. Taken together, they form a pattern. They form the preparation for an operational environment where you can deploy close air support aircraft, platforms that require clear target identification and freedom of maneuver at low altitudes, into a theater that was previously considered too contested for that mission profile. The A-10 Warthog is not a first day of war asset. It is not the aircraft you send into an environment where you are still suppressing air defenses. It is the aircraft you send when you have already achieved a level of battle space awareness and defensive degradation that allows for precision engagement with acceptable attrition rates. But here is the part most people miss, and this is where the strategic calculation becomes truly significant. The A-10's primary armament is the GAU-8 Avenger, a 30mm rotary cannon designed to destroy armored vehicles and hardened structures. It also carries Maverick missiles, precision-guided munitions, effective against small, fast-moving targets like patrol boats. In the context of the Strait of Hormuz, that payload configuration is optimized for exactly one mission set: destroying Iranian fast attack craft and coastal missile batteries in a target-rich, time-sensitive environment. These are not aircraft you deploy for symbolic purposes. The operational costs, the logistical footprint, the maintenance requirements of keeping A-10 squadrons forward deployed in the Gulf region are substantial. You do not incur those costs unless the mission requirement is real and the threat assessment supports their employment. So when the United States positions these aircraft in theater, it is making several statements simultaneously. First, we have degraded your sensor networks to the point where we can operate at altitudes you should theoretically be able to contest. Second, we have identified and targeted your fast attack craft moorings, your missile battery locations, your command nodes, and we are confident we can strike them faster than you can disperse them. Third, we are willing to demonstrate that confidence publicly, which means we are no longer concerned about revealing our intelligence penetration, because the operational advantage is now secure enough that disclosure does not compromise it. Now pull the lens back and look at what this means in terms of historical pattern. This is not the first time the United States has contested Iranian control over the strait. In 1988, during the final phase of the Iran-Iraq War, the so-called Tanker War, Iranian forces were attacking neutral shipping in an attempt to prevent Iraqi oil exports. The United States launched Operation Praying Mantis In April 1988, a one-day naval engagement that destroyed 2 Iranian oil platforms, sank 1 frigate, and disabled another. That operation demonstrated American willingness to use direct force to keep the strait open. But what happened after that operation is the key lesson. Iran did not close the strait. Iran did not escalate to full confrontation. Iran recalibrated. It accepted that its closure threat was not operationally viable against a committed American response, and it shifted strategy toward proxy forces, regional influence operations, and asymmetric pressure points outside the Gulf. That pattern, the cycle of Iranian escalation followed by American demonstration of conventional superiority followed by Iranian strategic adjustment, has repeated multiple times. The difference now is that the technology gap has widened dramatically. In 1988, the United States had satellite reconnaissance and signals intelligence. In 2026, the United States has real-time synthetic aperture radar, persistent drone surveillance, cyber intrusion into Iranian military networks, and defensive systems that can track and engage multiple small targets simultaneously. The Iranian playbook, the swarm tactics, and the mine warfare and the coastal missile ambushes were designed for an earlier technological era. They have not adapted at the pace required to maintain credible deterrence against the sensor and strike capabilities that exist today. And this brings us to the financial and economic dimension that makes the current situation particularly acute. Crude oil prices spiked by 4% in trading today following the initial reports of the A-10 deployment. That sounds like a market response to increased tension. But look more carefully at the structure of that move. Oil futures did not price in a sustained supply disruption. They priced in short-term volatility with an expectation of resolution. The risk premium embedded in Gulf crude cargoes has actually decreased over the last 6 months, not increased. Insurance underwriters, the entities that have the most direct financial exposure to strait closure risk, are behaving as if they assess the probability of sustained interdiction as lower now than it was a year ago. Why? Because the intelligence community assessments that inform those risk models now include the information we just discussed. The surveillance density, the targeting preparation, the demonstrated degradation of Iranian defensive networks. The market is not reacting to the deployment itself. The market is reacting to what the deployment reveals about American confidence in maintaining freedom of navigation even under direct Iranian challenge. And that market signal, that shift in risk pricing, is something Tehran's economic planners are watching very closely because it undermines one of their few remaining sources of international leverage. Some of you may be asking at this point, if Iranian deterrence has been degraded to this degree, why have we not seen a more aggressive American or Israeli posture toward other Iranian strategic interests, particularly the nuclear program? That is the right question, and the answer reveals the complexity of the current regional balance. The Strait of Hormuz deterrence was always the most visible, the most publicly understood element of Iranian strategy, but it was not the only element. Iran still possesses ballistic missile capabilities that threaten regional capitals. Iran still maintains proxy forces in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen that can impose costs on American allies. Iran still has a nuclear program that, according to International Atomic Energy Agency reports from February 2026, is now within weeks of breakout capability for weapons-grade enrichment if the decision were made. So the degradation of strait deterrence does not eliminate Iranian strategic options. What it does is force Tehran to rely more heavily on those other tools, and each of those tools carries its own risks and limitations. Ballistic missile strikes would invite massive retaliation and possible regime change operations. Proxy escalation disperses the conflict, but also disperses control and increases the risk of unintended escalation chains. Nuclear breakout would likely trigger immediate military action from Israel and possibly the United States. What the loss of strait deterrence does is narrow Iran's menu of viable responses to pressure. And that narrowing is what makes this moment particularly dangerous, not because it makes Iranian action more likely, but because it makes Iranian miscalculation more likely. Now let us look at how regional actors are interpreting this development, because their behavior in the next 60 to 90 days will tell us whether this shift is being understood as a new equilibrium or as a precursor to further action. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have maintained public silence on the A-10 deployment, but both countries have quietly increased coordination with American Central Command on air defense integration. That coordination is not defensive in nature. It is enabling. It creates the infrastructure for expanded American air operations from Gulf bases without requiring public announcements or parliamentary approvals. Israel has also remained publicly quiet, but Israeli defense officials have been meeting with their counterparts in Washington and Riyadh with unusual frequency over the last 3 weeks. Those meetings are almost certainly focused on synchronizing contingency planning for scenarios where Iranian nuclear progress crosses a threshold that requires action. The reason the Strait deterrence degradation matters in that context is that it removes one of Iran's primary retaliatory options. If Iran could credibly threaten to close the Strait in response to strikes on its nuclear facilities, that threat would impose significant costs on any attack planning. But if that threat is no longer credible, if the assessment is that American and allied forces can keep the Strait open even under Iranian interdiction attempts, then the cost-benefit calculation of a preventive strike shifts. It does not make the strike inevitable. It makes it thinkable in a way it was not before. And this is where the story becomes truly important, because we are not just talking about military positioning. We are talking about the logic of regional deterrence stability coming apart in real time. For 3 decades, the Persian Gulf security architecture has rested on a relatively stable set of mutual deterrence relationships. Iran could not win a conventional war, so it built asymmetric capabilities. The United States and its allies could not tolerate regime change operations because of the spillover risks, so they contained and pressured Iran through sanctions and limited strikes. Saudi Arabia and Israel could not directly coordinate because of the Palestinian issue, so they worked through American intermediaries. That system was stable not because anyone liked it, but because each actor understood the limits and costs of escalation. But when one pillar of that structure, the Strait closure threat, loses credibility, the entire architecture shifts. Actors who were previously deterred from certain actions begin recalculating. Options that were previously too risky become plausible. And the risk of miscalculation, the risk that one side misjudges the other's resolve or capabilities or intentions, increases dramatically. That is what we are seeing tonight. Not a crisis, not yet, but the conditions that make crises more likely. So where does this go from here? Let us walk through the scenario space carefully, because the range of possible outcomes is wider than it appears. Scenario 1, Iranian restraint and strategic adjustment. Tehran recognizes that its Strait deterrence has been compromised. It does not test American resolve. It accepts the new reality and shifts resources toward other tools, particularly cyber capabilities and proxy force enhancement. In this scenario, we see continued low-level tensions, continued rhetoric, but no direct military confrontation. The probability of this scenario is moderate, perhaps 35 to 40%, because it requires Iranian leadership to accept a significant loss of strategic leverage without attempting to demonstrate that the loss is not as complete as it appears. Scenario 2, asymmetric escalation through proxies. Iran directs Houthi forces in Yemen to increase attacks on shipping in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, or it activates Hezbollah to increase border tensions with Israel, or it instructs militia forces in Iraq to target American personnel. This scenario allows Tehran to impose costs without directly engaging American forces in the Gulf, thereby avoiding the demonstration that its Strait deterrence is indeed compromised. Probability of this scenario is higher, perhaps 40 to 45%, because it preserves Iranian leverage while diffusing risk. Scenario 3, direct but limited Iranian action in the Strait. Iran attempts a demonstration, perhaps harassment of a commercial vessel or a warning strike near, but not at American assets, designed to show that its deterrence is still functional. This is the most dangerous scenario because it creates a commitment trap. If Iran acts and the United States responds with overwhelming force, Iran must either escalate further or accept public defeat. If Iran acts and the United States does not respond proportionally, American credibility is questioned and the regional recalculation we discussed accelerates. Probability of this scenario is lower, perhaps 15 to 20%, precisely because the risks are so asymmetric. Scenario 4, external shock that changes the game entirely. A third party, possibly a non-state actor, possibly a regional state seeking to exploit tensions, conducts an attack or provocation that is attributed to Iran, correctly or incorrectly, and forces both Washington and Tehran into response modes they did not choose. This scenario is unpredictable by definition, but the probability is not zero, perhaps 5 to 10%, and it is worth considering because the current environment, the increased surveillance, the forward deployed strike assets, the heightened alert postures creates more opportunities for miscommunication and misattribution. The October 2023 attacks on Israel demonstrated how quickly a localized provocation can cascade into a regional crisis when multiple actors are operating under high tension and low trust. The Gulf environment today has similar characteristics. Multiple actors, competing interests, extensive surveillance, but imperfect attribution capabilities, and a general sense that the status quo is unsustainable. That combination is historically associated with sharp, unexpected escalations that no single actor intended, but that the system structure made probable. What this all means, the larger pattern that tonight's deployment reveals, is that we are watching the slow motion collapse of the post-2015 regional security architecture in the Middle East. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, was never just about nuclear weapons. It was an attempt to create a framework where Iranian behavior could be constrained through economic incentives rather than military confrontation. That framework collapsed when the United States withdrew in 2018, and what replaced it was not a new stable equilibrium, but a series of escalatory cycles. Maximum pressure sanctions from 2018 to 2021. Iranian nuclear program acceleration from 2021 to 2024. Proxy conflicts in Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and Lebanon throughout. Israeli strikes on Iranian facilities and personnel. And now, in 2026, we have reached a point where the military balance has shifted enough that one of the core assumptions of Iranian strategy, the ability to threaten Gulf energy flows, is being openly challenged. History tells us that when deterrence relationships break down, they do not break down gradually. They break down suddenly, often in ways that surprise everyone involved, because the stability was always more fragile than it appeared. The question is not whether the current situation is tense. The question is whether the actors involved understand how close they are to crossing thresholds that cannot be uncrossed. If what you heard tonight made you think, if it challenged your assumptions about what this deployment actually signifies, subscribe for ongoing strategic analysis because the next few weeks will be critical. Drop a comment below. Which regional actor has the most to lose if Iran's straight deterrence is confirmed as non-credible, Saudi Arabia, Israel, or the United Arab Emirates? And in the next video, we need to examine something that almost no one is discussing: the implications of this shift for China's energy security calculations and why Beijing's response to Gulf instability may be the real story that determines how this ends. See you there.